This is the Nobel Podcast, where we talk about how to optimize your technology, life, and mind. We're joined by special operations veterans, entrepreneurs, investors, and others who have overcome difficulty to make it to the top of their craft by staying in the fight. Welcome to the Nobel Podcast. I'm Sam Alaimo. I have Major General Brook Leonard, flown multiple aircraft, including the F-16 and the F-35, over 3,000 flight hours, including 576 combat hours, and recently retired after 31 years of service. Brook, welcome.
Sam, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really stoked to talk with you. So let's start from the beginning. Where did you grow up?
Grew up in Northern Virginia. I was an Army brat. My dad was stationed at the Pentagon. And so a little town, not so little anymore, called Annandale, Virginia. We had moved around a little bit before that. So we were there from kind of the second grade on. Just a beautiful, wonderful kind of 80s running around on my bikes, until the lights came on kind of life. It was really good.
Awesome. Army brat. So did you travel around a lot?
We did. Yeah. I was in 5 different locations before second grade. Some of them I remember, some of them I don't. I went to a German kindergarten. That's probably where my first memories began. But we traveled around a lot. And then my dad settled in at the Pentagon. He took a year-long tour in Korea so that we could come back and stay in Northern Virginia. And then he had an opportunity to promote and take command out in Fort Campbell, but he turned that down because he wanted stability for us. And a pretty incredible sacrifice, especially as I reflect back on the decisions and choices. And I'm very thankful for my father and what he showed me, and also how he allowed us to grow up and go to the same high school. It was pretty awesome.
So how long was he in for? What did he retire as?
He retired as lieutenant colonel promotable, and had a chance to go take command, and he turned that down. So 20 years, and then he got out.
I always ask this question too, and it's interesting with you having been a general. Did you get in trouble a lot as a kid?
Not in the classic sense. I had my bumps and bruises and my knocks, and trying to learn discipline and good decision making. And so, there were times where, I was restricted or couldn't drive my car around, but I learned and I grew, but really had a lot of fun doing it.
Military family, what was the earliest memory you had of knowing that you yourself wanted to actually join the military?
I would say that's probably, maybe 5th grade or so in terms of earliest memory. Really, my childhood was just saturated with the military. I remember going to one of my dad's change of commands on a parade field. There were military memorabilia and cool gear all over the house. And so it was just saturated with the military family, serving your country. I could tell my dad really enjoyed what he did. And, every once in a while when we had a friend over or maybe a girlfriend over, he'd tell some stories from Vietnam. Otherwise, he was pretty quiet about that. But, I knew that I loved that sort of teamwork and I wanted to serve. And so from a very early age, I was kind of pointed in the direction of the military, if you will.
Let's dig in on that. So Vietnam, I just read Chicken Hawk. You read that book?
No, I haven't.
Really good. Robert Mason, Chicken Hawk, helicopter pilot in the first cav in Vietnam.
Really?
What did your dad do in Vietnam?
Well, he flew helicopters in Vietnam. So he flew the Cobra gunship before that. So that was his second tour. The first tour, he flew the Bird Dog, and that was when the Army did some fixed wing FAC, but the Air Force took that over, and so he transitioned to the Cobra. Most of his stories, and I could tell just a real passion for being a forward air controller and bringing in fires. At that time, they had a lot of autonomy. So he would fly and land, figure out where the enemy was, pick up some food and then launch again. And that's what he did for a whole tour.
The stories, just because it's fresh in my mind, are incredible. Like flying a rotary wing aircraft in the jungle at low elevation with the kind of firepower that they had there was that took some courage.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And, just the way he talks about it with tons of humility and just some really fun memories. So, but I'm thankful he made it through that. And it's really neat to be able to live under someone that had that opportunity and was able to kind of just pass along the lessons learned from that.
I wonder when you got in, so I think it was 92, if I'm not mistaken, were there kind of grizzled Vietnam vets that you had to make your way past and earn the respect of, or was that a little later?
There was a little bit of that. I would say less so in the Air Force. Most of the instructor pilots and so forth that I grew up with were kind of, maybe a half generation past the Vietnam era, if you will. I did have a lot of simulator instructors, particularly at pilot training, that were of that sort. And again, those folks had incredible stories, and the fact that they were still giving back and still sharing their lessons learned, whether it was from just tactically how to do a fix to fix or how to just carry yourself as an officer to make sure you're ready for combat. I really appreciated them. The lessons and the bumps and the bruises they had were there for sure, but they wanted to make the next generation better, and really the next generation after that. I mean, they served for a really long time in my mind.
So fifth grade, knew you wanted the military. What was the instigation to become a pilot?
It was really teamwork. So there are a lot of folks, a lot of pilots, and I think this is great. They grow up wanting to slip the surly bonds, and maybe they got their private pilot's license. They got a demo flight at some point, or actually flew. I didn't do that. I grew up playing a lot of sports. Really a 3-season athlete, all the way from since I could basically walk, if you will. And that teamwork and that camaraderie was what really drew me. I got a chance when I was at the Air Force Academy to go out during one of our summer programs and just sample kind of the different mission sets across an organization. And while I think it's true for every MOS or AFSC, in any service, there's always a core bit of teamwork. But in the flying world, especially in the Air Force, I just saw it in spades. And so that teamwork that I had in high school was something that I wanted to continue to have in my adult life. And so that's really what drew me to being a pilot and flying.
I'm not familiar with it. So Air Force Academy, do you have to go through some sort of selection process to be able to fly? Is that kind of like the pinnacle of it and you had to earn your way into it?
You did, absolutely. So Air Force Academy, 4-year institution, you get your bachelor's coming out of there based on order of merit, both military, academically, and physically. You're able to put in your dream sheet, and then, if you make the cut, you get to choose. And our year, we actually had about 800 folks that were pilot qualified. And because we were kind of in the drawdown years, this is 92, as you mentioned, we were trying to take a peace dividend after the wall fell and so forth. And so they actually cut back the number of pilots they took that year to 400. And so it was a pretty selective process, but based on your order of merit, you got to at least put in for, and then you were selected to what career field you'd go, and then what training base you went to, and what date. Actually, we got to pick all that, which was kind of nice.
So did you go straight from Air Force Academy to flight school?
I did. Yep. We had a little bit of delay because the pipeline was a little bit expanded again, just because we were slowing things down. I worked in the legal office at Shepherd Air Force Base for a couple months before I started flying in November.
Let's dig into flight school. How difficult was it? And I guess for you personally, what were the biggest challenges? How'd you get over them?
I would tell you it's really hard, and but it's a good hard. You have your class, lots of teammates at Shepherd Air Force Base. It's a program called Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training. So you have all the NATO nations put their students through that. And so we had a class that had very little Americans and actually a lot of different folks from Europe. And so it was a really fun class. You're working hard, training hard, beside each other. For me, like I said, I didn't really have that flying background, if you will. And my roommate actually got me a clock, and I still have it today. And it says it's similar to an altimeter in an aircraft. And the joke was, I asked a question about above ground level. And so this is a very sort of simple concept in flying, just that you set, obviously, based on pressure altitude, where you are on the ground, and then you can measure above ground level, or you could be mean sea level, which would be just your absolute altitude. And I had a hard time actually conceiving the differences between the two. So he got me a clock, and it's still a joke today. I'm still good friends with him. But so little things like that, I really was behind the power curve on. And so I had to do a lot of studying. And I learned this thing called chair flying, where you actually rehearse the mission or the simulator that you're about to do. And chair flying is something that I've carried with me my whole life, just kind of that pre-mission rehearsal, essentially. And so I used those tools. I had some great instructors, and it turned out really well. So I was able to, graduate and select into an F-16, and off to the races from there.
Did you say chair flying?
Chair flying, yeah. So you sit in your chair, Back then we just had, really, it was a poster that replicated the cockpit of the training aircraft that we were flying. Nowadays, they have, online simulators and all kinds of things you can do even from your phone. But back then I just, yeah, sat in front of the chair in my room in front of this poster. It looked kind of funny. We have knee boards, which basically carried the checklists and the in-flight guides and the information that we needed to fly. And so I sat there just like I would sit in a plane, not in my flight suit, in my slippers, if you will, but I would push, buttons on the poster and make the radio calls and try to make it as realistic as possible.
That's gold. So you were essentially visualizing, you were essentially putting yourself in an aircraft while sitting in your room, hotel room, barrack, wherever, and just getting after it and not muscle memory, but neuronal memory. You were building some sort of database.
Yep, over and over and over again. I can't tell you how much time I spent in that chair, more than I spent in the plane, to be honest with you.
That's gold. Do you still use that method for other aspects of life, or did you use it for other aspects besides just flying?
Yeah, absolutely. I used it in sports. Now, when I grew up playing sports, visualization really wasn't that big of a thing. In fact, I don't even know if it was discovered, if you will. But after that, I've used it. I've used it in competition. I also use it to get ready for each day. I actually chair fly my schedule the night prior, and that really helps me prepare.
So I'm curious, has flight school in the 90s changed to, let's say, post 9/11 and then to the current day as of 2023? How has it changed? Do you think it's been a significant impact, significant difference?
Yeah, it's it's kind of funny you asked that. In some ways, it hasn't changed at all. In fact, we're still flying some of the same aircraft that we flew before with a little bit of software upgrades, but not much. And so, that's one big challenge for the Air Force. And really, I think the whole military is just reconstituting ships and planes and tanks, to keep up with the technological advances that we have. And so, in some ways, we're still flying and training the very same way that we did before. There's been some advances in simulators. And so some of your pre-mission work that you'd have to do in a plane, you can actually accomplish in a simulator now pretty well. And so that's changed a little bit. In my experience, there's less reps and sets, as I like to call them, in the current training. And I think that hurts a little bit, as a pilot, a soldier, whatever your profession is, getting out on the real field, getting up in the air in this case is really important because the unknown happens and you're dealing with all the psychological and physiological differences. So, I think in some ways it's a slight step backwards. And then probably to the crux of your question, how's it changed with the mission, that our nation, or the security problems that our nation faces? And I would tell you that those kinds of differences come more in your follow-on training. So your basic flight school is just how do you aviate, navigate, and communicate. And then, how do we counter terrorism, or how do we counter a near peer? Those nuances have sort of revolved from, very focused on Russia before the wall fell, and, then transitioning to the war on terror, more close air support, and then now transitioning back to a near peer or near peers with Russia and China. And then just how do you integrate with a lot of other technology like drones and so forth. So, in some ways it's kind of cycled back around to great power competition through, counterterrorism, and how air power kind of helps out in that area.
That leads me to my next question. So I am curious, from like a global conflict perspective, how prepared are we given the use of drones we're seeing in Ukraine, for example, which is extraordinary. There's overlapping fields of drones conducting warfare when it's no longer fighting in the tribal lands of Afghanistan, but fighting other people with jets, with night vision goggles, with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Warfare has radically changed from the global war on terror in a worse direction, I think. How prepared do you think we are at present for that challenge?
Yeah, Sam, I would kind of tackle that question by first, just the framework that I look through change and warfare and keeping up with technology and on all these things is really along three axes. It's organization, it's thought, and it's technology. And so when you ask about preparation, I feel like in some ways organizationally we've changed. We've certainly gotten a lot better at joint warfare. And a lot of that was driven home just because we needed to be that way. And I thought we did a really good job. Across the many tours I had in Iraq and Afghanistan, I saw our ability to integrate air power, land power, sea power, and it just got better and better. And then our understanding of the psychological, our understanding of winning hearts and minds and winning the peace and not just winning the war, I think really grew throughout those decades, if you will. So organizationally, I think pretty good. Technology, I think we're a little bit behind in terms of adopting just the speed of change that's out there and how capabilities aren't platform centric, but they're really network centric. And then thinking, I think, is the other piece that we're a little bit behind on. So, historically, we've had two oceans. Canada and Mexico haven't been really nasty neighbors at all to us. And so the homeland has really been sacrosanct. We've had the ability, like Pearl Harbor, obviously got attacked in World War II, but we're able to generate, the arsenal of democracy and really out industrialize and outfight, Germany in that case and Japan. And then, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, we had a lot of time and we had some sanctuary, even really close in Saudi Arabia and so forth, to be able to mass firepower, kick him out of Kuwait, then push him back up into Iraq. I will tell you that we do not have those sanctuaries today, whether it's, the ubiquitousness of space, cyber, obviously two really powerful competitors in Russia and China. And then the war on terror continues and we have malign actors in North Korea and Iran and so forth. And so it's a very dynamic environment and we're out of time and space. And so whereas before we were able to wake, America up and figure out a way to win and win, I don't think we have that time anymore. And so being able to change without a catastrophic or catalytic type of event is something that we need to be really good at. And mentally, I don't think we're there. And so I would tell you that I would put us slightly behind in where I'd like to see us. So organizationally, joint warfare, I think we're doing a pretty good job. Integrating space and cyber into air, land, and sea, I think we're behind on. And then really conceptualizing the changes that technology and the impacts on the battlefield and how that applies with really no time. Everything is competition. Everything is really in conflict all the time. And really, how do we then try to make sure that we prevent and deter? So I think we need to elevate our thinking in that area, and we need to elevate the integration of technology a lot more.
You bring up so an incredible point I didn't even think about when I asked the question. So if you had a magic wand when it comes down to fixing thought and technology, you raised the point that, this is a democracy. And it's never been easy for us to just snap our fingers and say we need to fix things. We usually wait for the impetus. And the impetus might be pretty painful. So like if you were able to fix the thought and the technology by also taking into consideration, you need to get the country behind it. How would you begin to do that?
This is a saying that I heard, and I can't remember where I picked it up. I wish I did, but I wrote it down in one of those green notebooks a long time ago and still have it. And it talks about defeat comes from a desire for comfort and a passive outlook. And so that's where I would begin. There's education, there's understanding. I think the military and the government in particular really needs to, first of all, understand the environment that we're in and the warfare, lawfare, economic, warfare, and just all the different ways an Eastern mindset like China brings to battle. It's more Sun Tzu than Clausewitzian, but it's even more than that. And so we really need to understand it ourselves, and then we need to really be able to communicate it in a very methodical way. And then despite whether there's a complete understanding across the country, I think at a minimum, the warfighters that are in charge with defending our national security really need to take on that mindset. And we need to do what we can with the budgets that we have. And I understand that, generally you can do more with more, but I've always been convicted with you need to do what your mission requires, regardless of the resources. And so, now it's time to think. And so really changing that mindset, understanding how, more of an Eastern versus Western mindset, how they fight, sort of win without fighting, so we wake up someday and then all of a sudden you're past the fight and you've lost, and that's very much the way China attacks problems. And so we need to be mindful of that, as well as Russia and great power competition and brute force. I think that's maybe more applicable in that direction. And then the fact that you're never going to get rid of terrorism and sort of malign actors across the world. And so, how do we partner? How do we team up? But really, how do we think and focus on return on investment? It really comes down to what are my most important mission sets? Which ones do I have the resources to accomplish, and draw the line and get after it?
So you've got a massive career. I just kind of went through and picked points that were even more interesting than all the other points. So I'm going to skip ahead to 9/11. Where were you when 9/11 happened?
I was at Misawa Air Base, Japan, so northern part of the main island. A great air base. The Navy's there, Japan's there, the Japanese Air Force is there, and then we have a couple fighter squadrons there. It was sort of an odd time. We were about 12 hours ahead, and so we were woken up and, very early in the morning, and the word was turn on your TV and stand by for words. And so we saw it from, almost like through a looking glass. A lot of people, that were stranded in airports or actually that got launched into fighter caps, sort of very active. But we were like looking through the TV and trying to understand from, many time zones away. We obviously locked down the base, but just a lot of question marks. And then, what was the world going to be like, tomorrow was the forefront question for us.
How did it impact your personal career? You grew up around the military, probably inspired, just patriotic. How did this change your career trajectory, your personality, your desire to get after it?
It was really an enhancement to kind of some seeds that had already been planted. I'd been really fortunate to have one of my early assignments at Osan Air Base, Korea. And, that war, the Korean War isn't over, as an armistice. And so, very hot at times, an evil dictator up north that we were defending South Korea from. And so training and the readiness focus that we had, we call it Fight Tonight. And that was how I grew up. And that was different than how a lot of other people that I knew grew up that didn't really get an opportunity early in their career to go on Peninsula and kind of see that. And so, this was the Cold War. So if you weren't in Korea, you had Desert Storm, but, that was about it mindset wise. And, the war on terror really hadn't kicked off. And so there was this little blip, Saddam, okay, bad actor, we put him back in his box. But really, we had a Cold War mindset, except in Korea, we had a fight tonight mindset. And so realistic readiness was some of the seeds that were already planted in my brain. And 9/11 just poured water and fertilizer or gas and fire, like however you want to think about, on the fact that we have to be ready wherever we are. And so what is that sort of realistic way that we train every day to make sure we're psychologically ready, we're physically ready, our tactics and organization are ready? And so what it did is just catalyze that focus. And then, I got the opportunity to put that into practice and in many ways try to help our national security and making the war on terror an away game, instead of a home game, if you will. And so that moment really kind of sharpened what I had already learned and really put a picture on it. And it was really, I think, important because I carried that with me throughout, the rest of my career. It was since 9/11, so 22 years. And so, the 2/3 of my career was post 9/11. A lot of tours and a lot of time to put realistic readiness in place.
Yeah. So jumping forward from 2001 to 2012, your role at CAF, Kandahar Air Base, I was in Afghanistan with a rifle and a radio on the ground. So a sniper to JTAC. You had a very different role. So talk about some of your work in Afghanistan at that time area, because if I remember correctly, the most kinetic time in Afghanistan was 2010 to 2013. So what kind of work were you doing?
Yeah, really kinetic. And Sam, thanks for your service on the ground. I mean, I got a chance to do a couple convoys, and that's tough living, but it was really important. And, it was our honor to be able to protect those forces on the ground and make sure they could get their job. That was our number one opportunity. When I arrived, just a little bit after midnight, when I flew into Afghanistan, as I was about to take command at the operations group there, and we got rocketed, so we took cover. Nothing really kind of came of it. It was in, the rockets landed in a space that wasn't very populated. They weren't meant to be accurate. They're more of harassment. But, I remember getting up after dusting myself off and looking around at an incredible amount of air power, on the ramps there at Kandahar. And, a rocket goes a little bit left or a little bit right, not only could it hurt a lot of people, but it could hurt a lot of air power. And so I adopted the saying that we don't have air superiority on the ground, and we need to pay attention to base defense. And so, from the beginning, that really became my focus. Another thing that I learned was we didn't really do a good job of interfacing with all the different forces on the ground through, mostly Marines and Army, and telling them of the different ways and capabilities that we had. And, there are people all over Afghanistan, as you know, from all kinds of different services. They all had different spin ups. Some of them knew kind of what air power could bring, some of them didn't, but it's not their fault. It's, I felt like it was the onus on us to get out there and teach and educate and connect, really connect, personality to personality. And that way we would be much better, when the chips were down the next day. And so that was the second big push that I had, was to make sure we educated folks on the ISR capabilities we had. We developed a weapon that you could drop very close to structures or people that you didn't want to hurt, but still get after the target itself. And then we had some laser guided as well as GPS capabilities that we could drop through the weather in some cases. And then the other piece was we rushed all kinds of things into battle. We even had an airplane, that we bought from some doctors in, flying from Nevada to Canada, and we put a bunch of Hollywood cameras on it and we turned it into an ISR platform. And so, here we are, contractors were flying it. The government was sort of responsible for it. We had a Walmart business jet, that we put some communication nodes on. And the pilots went to, a couple simulators in London before they came out to Afghanistan and flew this plane where, you could scrape the wings, and we flew it very high and Max performed it. So I could go on and on, but you probably saw it on the ground too. We were rushing technology into the fight, which I think was great. But, the people that were using them, we had waivers. We didn't really have the training pipeline. And so I felt like we weren't as effective, but also there was a big risk there. And it's really not hard to take those kinds of things and put them into the framework of just how we operate as a military. We have training guides and we have, rules and regulations, and not to encumber the technology with that, but to put it into that just far enough to where we could actually, get the advantages we want and produce the effect on the ground that we wanted. And in some cases, we were a danger to ourselves. And so that was kind of my third big push. And so defending the base and really dedicating air power and coordinating with some folks out on the ground, we were able to do that. We actually cut the rocket fire to historically low levels. It's the first time we didn't get rocketed over Christmas. And, we didn't lose any airplanes, based on enemy attacks. And we didn't lose any people either. And we were able to project air power on a very consistent basis, because during a rocket attack, everything shut down. So that worked out really well. I think we educated and learned really well. And then I think we also normalized really well. And so those were my big pushes in Kandahar, a tour that I look back on really fondly.
Let's jump ahead to 2018 Iraq, which is kind of the next phase of the war in Iraq with the Islamic State group. You organized across 11 different locations, if I remember correctly. Dig into some of the work you did there, because that is a particularly virulent, cancerous phase of the war, and it's probably difficult to manage.
Yeah, virulent is a really good word. I mean, Mosul had fallen kind of earlier December the year previously. And, Iraq was all in because they finally realized, that the enemy was at their throat, several miles out of Baghdad, and they were able to push them back, and they understood that their country was at stake. And so there was some really incredible fighting. The U.S. obviously leading the charge, but Iraq was all in. And so that was, pretty incredible. And then ISIS kind of was ebbing in, or reducing in terms of their capability, but really there was a more tricky sort of integrated adversary. And that was just all kinds of different people inside of Iraq, that had different intents for that country. And, Sunni, Shia, et cetera. And then you had Iran, incredible malign influence and incredible penetration into the government of Iraq. And and the military and a lot of paramilitary forces kind of scattered throughout. And then ISIS was going to ground, which in many cases makes for a very dangerous enemy because presented on the battlefield, pretty easy to find, fix, track, target, and eliminate. But, going to ground and mixing up with the people and really kind of in the reset phase, if you will. And so we had them pretty much cornered in the Merv, the middle Euphrates River Valley. So kind of the intersection of the border between Iraq and Syria and the Euphrates River. And so we had, for their main fighting force, we had pretty much contained them and were encircling them then with a lot of partnering with some other forces, in Syria mostly. But the influence with Iran and sort of the connection with all the different parties that they fight through in Lebanon, and we can see all of that today in Hamas and so forth. And so here we are. I got the task to create a wing from really two different parts, and that was our air advising part. So the Air Force, the Army Air Forces, and the air defense for Iraq, but then running those 11 different FOBs, if you will, bases, if they were a little bit fancier and had electric power across Iraq and Syria. And so really the mindset that I took into that fight was we're a supporting arm, but we need a partner. We need a partner with, all the different forces, whether it was special operations or the different services at all the different FOBs. And we got people and ammunition and supplies and diplomats all over Iraq and Syria. And that mobility was really critical to doing the mission that we had. And then we also needed to partner up with Iraq and, try to set them on their feet, at least militarily. That was, the mission we had and kind of the area of the world that we could control. And so how do we help them get their C-130s up to speed, get their F-16s in the fight? I was shocked to see that their F-16s weren't on the air tasking order. And so we actually got them up and got them on the air tasking order and, sort of help themselves, if you will. And then, it was kind of a bizarre time because we had all these partners fighting over and throughout Iraq, but not partnered with Iraqis. And so, just really interesting time, but focusing on partnering and support and then trying to set the long view. So what do we want out of this? When we finally, took out the main fighting force of ISIS in the Merv, so what's next? Well, we need to go into sort of a counterterrorism mindset because that's exactly, kind of what ISIS adapted. And then how do we deal with Syria and the partnered forces and the pressure from Turkey? And so a very interesting mix of political and military. But I thought focusing on high return on investment, focusing on what we could influence, and focusing on partnering both with the joint force and with Iraq's military was really important. And so I combined my two halves. And so whether you were an advisor before or a logistician and kind of had the supply and air support mindset, everybody had to have that same mindset. And so folks running air terminals were teaching Iraqis how to do that on their side. Folks that were primarily doing advise and assist ended up thinking about how could we partner with them to provide more supplies and more services to the joint forces and how we could do that better. And so kind of combining those aspects into an overall focus on support and high return on investment with a long view was really important to us. But yeah, interesting time for sure.
Let's jump forward to United States Space Command. So you were chief of staff. I mean, that's incredible. How long after it was established did you become chief of staff?
Yeah, so I was there at T minus 20. So I was actually picked in February of 19. And so I was still in Iraq when I actually interviewed with Acting Secretary Shanahan. So he was the Acting Secretary of Defense, and I interviewed for the job. And he told me afterwards I got it. So I was thankful, kind of sweating there a little bit. But literally, I was on a VTC at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, in my full battle rattle. And so he let me know I was going to be the chief of staff. I contacted the person that they felt was going to be the interim commander. And since it wasn't a full organization, fully signed off yet, General Raymond was, slated to be the commander, but, we can't assume that Congress takes those nominations and actually affirms them. And so the staff had been picked. And as the chief of staff, I started reaching out and trying to understand. I didn't have a lot of bandwidth to be able to do that because I was still working a lot in Iraq, as I just previously described. Got to spend some time with my family and then showed up on August 9th. So literally 20 days before we stood up on August 29th of 2019. And so ever since then till the 22nd of September 22, so just over 3 years, I was the chief of staff. And I joke, I did everything from parking spaces to outer space, standing up a new organization, particularly a combatant command. We don't get to do that every day, but it was quite a joy. Learned a lot from that and really satisfying because having an edge and an eye on space is really important, especially in this near peer competition, great power competition that we're in right now.
You essentially started a government funded massive startup. A lot of the listeners are entrepreneurs, they're executives. Talk about, I guess, what were one or two or three of the biggest challenges you had to face and how you got through them?
No, your description is spot on. Yeah, it's so many ways like a startup. And in this next chapter, I actually work with a couple startups too, so I'm seeing it from the other side. So lessons learned. I think the first one and kind of the overarching lesson learned, I would say, is embrace and appreciate change, especially sort of mandated change. In other words, standing up a new combatant command, everybody knows there's going to be change. You got to build an organization, you got to build the culture, you got to build the processes. So everybody's kind of locked in on transformation and change. In other times in the military where, we needed to change, it wasn't labeled that. And so it was really hard kind of getting the team on board. And so, if you're in a startup or if you're in a company that acknowledges that it needs to change, I would embrace that. I would be really excited about it because if you don't like change, you're going to hate it being irrelevant and you're going to really hate defeat. And so we're changing all the time. The enemy's changing, the context is changing. If you're not changing, you're falling behind. And so I would just say embrace that because it's a really unique opportunity. And in a startup, you hopefully have identified, I'm going to make a difference. I mean, that's why we start things, is because we see an issue, we have a solution for it, and we want to put it into effect. And so having change as your environment, acknowledged environment, is such a blessing. The other thing is I've seen both in the military, this was how it was in Space Command, where we had 43 people on, August 29th of 2019, but we had 100% of the mission. And so, the command now is close to 1,400 people. So 43 people, we're a long way from being able to do that. And we had lots of partners and folks that were helping us out along the way. And I assure you that we had the capability. It was just going to be really hard, to accomplish it. And we had a lot of help, especially from Strategic Command. That mission set was being pushed over from them to us. And so, but 43 people, and so we're like, we got to hire people and get people here and trained. And a lot of times the tendency is just to get people. And I had a senior Army leader tell me, he said, you have to go after great people. If they're not great, don't take them. If you try to get good people or mediocre people, or you just need people to sort of fill seats, you're going to create more problems than you really want. But he was absolutely right. The second thing that I would kind of really emphasize is improve your foxhole every day. I had a great Marine friend of mine when I worked in the Pentagon. We did a 24-hour bike race, and I would do a lap and then he would do a lap. And the laps were about 45-minute laps. And every time I came back, there was ice back in the cooler and the water was refreshed and, you cleaned up the space, I just would come back and lay on the cot, and he's like, every day improve your foxhole, And I took that mindset and, organizationally, what that means to me is work on the important non-urgent every day. The important urgent is just in your face. And, when you're in a foxhole, you got to fight, you got to shoot. And so it's hard, right, to get the time to improve your foxhole or to work on the important but non-urgent. But you have to discipline yourself, even if it's just one thing. And that's really what I try to push as the chief of staff. It's like just something small, because otherwise you can't get out of the spiral of do. And those problems keep coming back. And until you can put a process in place or something to where you don't get that problem again, now you're gaining ground. And that quickly paid off. And a lot of people really took that away as a big lesson because they're like, we were able to accelerate our growth because we took just a little bit of time, to try to do that. Those are probably my two biggest lessons. And then probably the other one, just to kind of tie it up, is people and fusing those people into teams really matter. And so I would take the time to get to know each other. Maybe it's an offsite, maybe it's just going out for a beer or whatever. But you got to know people deeper than the uniform, and you have to care for each other. And you really have to think about, one of my favorite sayings was, the team you're on is more important than the team you lead. And so as the chief of staff, you have all the joint directors, so 8 of them, and they're responsible for, J1's responsible for personnel, J2 for intel, all the way up to J8. They're running their teams really hard. But I told them, I said, the team that you're on, which is the Space Command team, and really even more broadly than that, the DoD team and the United States of America team, is more important than the team you lead. So have that bigger picture mindset and that up and out. And so I would encourage folks in startups, as they fill out their organizational structure, make it an accountability structure, and then understand that the number one thing that you're accountable to is the overarching mission of the team, of the organization, and not just getting your little part of it done. And so I think embracing change, hiring really great people, fusing them into teams, and then trying to do a little bit each day for that long term, that important, not urgent mindset, are really the things that I think could help out folks that are beginning and working through that startup madness.
Yeah, let's dig in there a little bit. So one of the hardest things is finding good leaders for your organization. What would be some of the traits that you looked for in, let's say, a young officer that people would be looking for in a young executive or some young VP in a company? What do you look for?
I would say they're the same. Having quality people in your organization foundationally, right? Really bringing in a great person with a good character, you can train them to do just about anything. And so foundationally, you have to have that. Now, if they also have that and they're deeply experienced in whatever job and mission that you're doing, that's bonus. But that is icing on the cake. So the cake, in my opinion, first of all, I would say a incredible core of integrity and trust. And really, the way I define that is, not only do they do the right things, but you can count on them to execute what they say they're going to execute. So, as for an example, like if I needed to have heart surgery, like my wife, I absolutely trust her, but she has no skills and can't deliver, in a heart surgery. Conversely, if there was a heart surgeon who absolutely could deliver and had those skills, but was a kind of a shady character, I wouldn't want him operating on me either. And so really those two sides to trust and integrity of, can I do the right thing? Am I aligned with the mission? And do I have, just a really good set of core values? But I also have the capability to deliver on my promises. And if I can't, I'll communicate that I need help or whatever. But to me, that's at the core of it. And then I would say on top of that is initiative, and particularly in a startup. But I would tell you really across the board, I would rather have someone that's, all thrust and no vector and just give them a little bit of tap left or right. But without that thrust, you're not going to get anything remarkable out of them. And so they're just going to be, taking up space, taking up salary, if you will. And so I think that just wraps around all of that is humility, with a sense of, others and making other people better. That's the core of a team. And I think through humility, you're going to get someone that wants to learn. And you have to, that learning, in my opinion, is a mission in every military organization. And it's a mission, an inherent mission in every startup or business. And so how do we learn and how do we get better? And so someone that's humble and will, be able to learn, alongside you and have that be a focus. Those are kind of the qualities that I think are really important in a leader, in a teammate, really in anybody that you bring into your organization.
How do you groom people for that position? And I ask because you raised the dichotomy of culture and competency. So when I look at people, there's a cultural fit and a competency fit. You got to
Yeah.
have like the right cultural fit, and then we'll do whatever it needs to get you up to the competency. If you have the right competency but not the right cultural fit, then potentially there's a problem there. How did you groom and grow and motivate people to kind of to grow into their roles?
I would just tell you overall, I think the culture fit is a lot harder. So I'd rather hire with most of those things in place than the competency side. But culture can be taught. I've seen it in the military and all those, new recruits all over, the different services, recruiting stations. You probably saw it in the SEALs, like you can build in that culture, but it's a lot harder. But to your question on how do you kind of train to that, I would tell you that sort of training, teaching people how to be a leader. And I really, we need leaders and followers. Everybody, works from the middle. Even the youngest private has, themselves to lead. And even, the most senior president of the United States, has to operate within certain confines and work with Congress, et cetera. And so we all lead and follow. I think it's really important that we can lead ourselves and that we have that outward mindset on a larger team. And so I encapsulate that into leadership. And I think that leadership is best taught through an apprenticeship methodology. And so I would unpack that a couple different ways. So first of all, I think there's coaching, mentoring, and advocating. So coaching, a lot of people think coach on the sideline yelling in plays, but if you go to Harvard and get a degree in coaching, they would teach you how to ask questions and not state imperatives. And so asking and finding out about the person and where they are and really digging, like that's coaching, I think, from, sort of a standard textbook sense. Mentoring is actually passing on experiences that you've had that may or may not fit, but could be helpful. And then advocating is looking out for the individual, not just to get, Johnny or Susie into a job because, they're your cousin, but to actually put great people in great positions where they can make a difference in the organization. So those are your three tools, I think, as a leader to do that. But then the apprenticeship method, I like Mr. Miyagi as an example here. So if you remember The Karate Kid, some of our audience might not go back and watch it. It's a great movie, but it's essentially about this guy picking up karate, and there's the arch rival team, and he meets this old guy, thinks he's a karate master, wants to learn from him, and he starts making him paint the fence and wash the car and sand the deck. And he's like, I came here to learn karate, and soon Mr. Miyagi's like, okay, I'll answer your question, and throws a couple punches and kicks, and he's painting the fence and waxing the car, basically deflecting. And he realizes that he's been teaching him the foundation of, how to do karate. And that apprenticeship method of first demonstrating and then growing and connecting the dots. So Mr. Miyagi kind of teaches him the basics and then grows and connects those into how to actually do karate. And then he sort of fades away into the background, as he goes into the championship. He's a little bit further away from the sidelines and giving him a little bit of pointers, but he's actually letting him grow and learn and remember and put into effect and actually make it his own. And so that's the process, I think, that I would use to describe apprenticeship. And so as you coach and mentor and advocate, think about that apprenticeship model where you build that foundation, you connect it, and then you fade back, as that person that's really trying to help somebody out. And that's, I think, the way, to answer your question, that we grow. I would also include, you need to have a framework and process around that. And so when that individual is interacting with you, they're obviously learning, you're teaching them and using that apprenticeship model, but then also the organization and how it does stuff reflects that culture. And just a really quick example on that, in Space Command, I really wanted a culture of teamwork. I talked about the team you're on is more important than the team you lead. And so I had a synchronization meeting where everybody across the entire staff came and we synchronized mostly on sort of administrative work. But at the very beginning of everybody's slide, they had to appreciate somebody else inside the organization. It was just something I put on the slide. I expected them to fill out. I didn't have to, twist anybody's arms. It was just an expectation. And they're like, well, here it is on the slide. I'll just fill it out. And it was just a way of saying thank you to other people. And that appreciation for the other parts of the organization and hearing that over and over again in the staff meeting created a sense of teamwork.
Let's flip it around. What was the best advice you have ever been given by a mentor?
I think it's the teamwork piece. That was driven to me really early on. And I would probably second it to you need to be realistically ready. I had a commander, we had just lost someone in an adjacent organization when I was at Nellis Air Force Base, and it was really hard. This person was, a very flamboyant, very awesome individual, and he passed away early on a Sunday morning. Went in Monday to fly. We were taking care of folks that were really hurting, and I canceled flying because people were really beat up. And I went into my commander's office and let him know that, and he asked me, he said, "Hey," he said, "if you were to die in combat, would you want your organization to take a knee or take the hill?" And I said, "Take the hill, absolutely." And he said, "Well, how do we learn how to do that?" And I'm like, "Well, I need to figure that out, but now's not the right time," is what I'm thinking. And he said, "We're flying." And so I actually had to go back into a room I just left and say, "Hey, we're flying." And, they looked at me like I had two heads. Went back to his office. By that time, maintenance senior leader had told him that that was probably a little bit too dangerous. And so he came off of that decision. I had to go back and tell him we weren't flying. Now they look at me like I had three heads. But I came back to his office and he said, "What did you learn?" And I said, one, backing up the decisions of your superiors and making your own is really hard. But really, the most important lesson I learned is that I hadn't thought through how would I use training events to prepare my unit for realistic combat. You're probably going to lose somebody. That's just the way it is. And so, how do you get people in training ready for that? And am I thinking through all the realistic parts of combat and making sure that I'm preparing people for it, the psychological parts, the how do we engage in Afghanistan in the heat or on top of a giant mountain in the snow and with people that I don't know if they're friendly, just really getting into the exact details and making sure our training can replicate that and we're preparing people for that. And so that lesson about realistic readiness and how you have to use your peacetime opportunities to make sure that you're ready. Otherwise, you're doing your organization a disservice was probably one of the most monumental pieces of advice that I've ever gotten.
That's gold. I want to wrap up the military. One question. So what was the best and the worst aspect of your 31-year career?
I think the best aspect was just really the people and the friends and the tough problems that we got to solve together. Like I said, I got into flying because I love the teamwork. I found it all over the Air Force and all over the Joint Force. And so being able to come together as a team, build a plan, whether it was a training plan or an op, out in Afghanistan or Iraq, and execute it really well and see the difference that you can make when you work together and you're focused on the overall mission. Those were the best days. We got a chance in Korea to actually give passports back to over 300 women that were being trafficked from the Philippines, just in the bars kind of outside of our base. And by shutting that down and, applying the resources and teaming with the Korean government to out the people that were doing that, again, we executed a plan, we made a difference in people's lives. And so whether it was that all the way to the battlefield, those kinds of moments were, those were the best ones that I'll always remember and really enjoyed. The tough days were the days we lost people. And, I'm sure you've seen that. I think everybody that's been in the military, we had a really bad spring in 19 was at Kandahar. We lost an F-16 and the pilot flying it. We lost an MC-12 and the four people in it. Two Army Blackhawks went down and we lost a bunch of lives there, and a cargo aircraft crashed taking off out of Bagram. And that was a really rough month and a half or so. Those were the hard times for sure.
You did the 31 years, incredible leadership experience, Chief of Staff, Space Command. Now you have a consulting practice. So you want to talk about that real quick? Well, what are you getting into?
Well, I'm just trying to give back in the next chapter. My first step in giving back is learning. And so, I stood up my LLC just as an opportunity to open myself up to all kinds of different opportunities out there. And I've consulted, over the last year from nonprofits, homeschool organizations, space startup, all kinds of different things, both on the Air Force side and the Space Force side, or things that are adjacent to that. And so really, I just picked a wide spectrum of things so I could learn about how to do business and how I could contribute, what applies, what doesn't apply, where my holes are, and where I needed to learn. And so that's really been the best part about it, is just really understanding how I can contribute and give back. And so I've gotten a lot of chance to do that. I'm looking to narrow the field a little bit, because I think I've learned a lot. It's not that I'm done learning, but I'd like to apply what I've learned in a little bit more precise ways.
How do people find your practice?
Well, they can go to my LinkedIn site, and if they want to connect with me on that, that's probably the best way. And I'd love to help out if I can. I really try to specialize in kind of process and content. So process, decision making, organizations, building those, teaming. I got a chance to, like you said, stand up a lot of startups, to include Space Command, in my 31 years. I got an overabundance of those assignments. I'm not really sure why. So I know how to do that really well, scaling, tackling interesting problems. And then content wise, integrating technology with tactics or thought, and making sure your organization is optimized. And as that particularly applies to air and space power, those are kind of my content specifics, if you will. But I've done a lot of different things, and I feel like if you want to grow as a team and get better as an organization, I can offer some tidbits from my experience, and be glad to do so.
Awesome. Let's do a lightning round. So,
All
kind of
right.
two things you do to prime yourself for the day. You mentioned chair flying, which is epic. So, what else do you do in the morning?
Well, I try to get up and hydrate, and again, focus on the day itself. And so turning tasks into calendar items is another really big thing. So hopefully I've chair flown really well and visualized my day and prepared for it. But then I try to run my day off my calendar and not my to-do list. And so blocking out opportunities. The other really big thing is energy matching. So I went to the Army War College and got an opportunity there to talk to a leadership philosophy specialist, and he said leadership is all about energy and executing. And so I'm a morning person, and after I work out, I'm super fired up. I'm an extrovert, so I love people and getting out and doing that. And so I take all the mundane tasks and I put them in the morning when I have my most energy. And then in the afternoon, when I'm, looking for a nap or a little bit tired, or I'm a long way from my early morning workout, then I put my people tasks, because I don't need to spend a lot of energy to do that. And so I try to make my schedule match my energy levels, where I have more in the morning generally, or after I work out, and less energy in the afternoon. So if I can balance that out, then I have a really good match to be able to execute.
What's your workout program like?
So community and competition, and for me that equals CrossFit.
Oh, nice,
So
nice.
yeah, and working out is my number one of number twos. And what I mean by that is, number one is, spending time with the family, getting the must do's done. And so my number one out of my number twos is working out. So I try to fit it in, just based on my schedule, and more importantly, and thankfully these days, my kids' schedule, which is really fun to work around.
Do you have a garage gym? Do you belong to the local CrossFit box? What do you do?
Yeah, local CrossFit box, and so they got classes throughout the day, and so I'll jump in on one of those, whatever works out best.
Awesome. What about end of the day? You mentioned taking a nap. How do you pivot away from, let's say, work mode to family mode?
I'm not really good at that. I've spent 31 years working at it. I'm still trying really hard to be able to pivot. And nowadays, especially with the remote work that I do in some cases, I need to pivot, when I just get up from a Zoom call and go out to fix lunch or something like that. And so I see the need to even be better at that. But when I'm successful, it's sort of like, if you remember Mr. Rogers, I apologize for all the 70s and 80s analogies, but if you can think about sort of the traditional, person comes home, opens the front door, takes off their jacket, puts it in the closet, takes off their shoes, puts them in the rack. That's kind of the idea, but mentally. So taking your work brain and very specific parts of that and say, hey, that project that I'm working on, I'm not working on it anymore. And you almost physically and mentally like hang it on a tree or put it on a hanger, is something that I try to do. And then if I can get in a box breath, so 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out, 4 seconds hold. If I can just get in one of those and I can sort of mentally hang some very specific things, in the closet, in the work closet, so I don't bring those into family time, that's when I'm successful, when I can do that.
How do you get into the zone? How do you get into like a deep work state?
So for me, it's focus, it's quiet, I'm prepared. I got everything, sort of around me that I need. If I need to have printouts, I got that printed out. If I've done the research, I need to do that. And it's very important to me, like I said, to be able to pre-chair flied. I always try to walk through the work I'm going to do before I actually begin doing the work. I find I get into a focused flow state a lot faster, and I understand sort of the twists and turns. And if I need to deviate on a branch plan or something like that, I've already sort of pre-flown it. And so I know where those points are, and it makes it a little bit easier to stay in the flow.
Last question, a couple books that have changed your life.
I'd start off with the Bible. When you talk about a servant leader, I don't think you're going to find anybody better than Jesus. On the other side of that, in terms of things that have been really impactful and practical, Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, talks about how change is really so hard and offers some methodologies on how actually to do that and how assumptions can kill you. So I love that. The Goal by Goldratt talks about breaking down problems and understanding. And this is true for most everything, I think, except for warfighting, in that there's a process and there's a factory floor that you have to figure out, where are your constraints? And it's really constraint management. I love The Effective Executive, about 170 pages, 14 font, can read it in a weekend, Peter Drucker. And it really talks about your responsibility as a leader to be effective. And a lot of times I think we get in the mindset of, I got all these people working for me, and I can just bark out orders and deep thoughts and let them do it. But how are you as a leader making sure that you are like ultimately effective? And the questions I've derived from his writings are, what should I do? How do I do it? How am I doing? How do I know how I'm doing? And how do I share? And that what should I do is really important, because a lot of times you can answer what do we do, but is that what you should be doing based on the changing mission, highest ROI, and then understanding how you do it. What are the pieces and parts if you can understand those connections? And then how are you doing? What kind of metrics and scorecard do you have? And methodologies do you have to kind of bring that out? And so that kind of covers, how do I know how I'm doing, and and how am I doing? And then how do I share? There's probably someone in an adjacent career field that you could either help or learn from. And so that's really The Effective Executive, I think, in a nutshell for me. And then Platoon Leader, McDonough. So this guy goes out, takes over a platoon in Vietnam that's not very good and doesn't really have good procedures, doesn't have really good teamwork, turns it around, even though it's really hard. And at least one or two times in the book, someone fires a warning shot, his own side, saying, hey, you're pushing us too much, or we don't like what you're doing. And he wins them over, and they become a very effective unit. Just a really impactful book on how you take an organization and change it for the better.
I got to check that one out. All right. Do you have anything you want to add?
Sam, I just want to say thanks to you. Thanks for your service. Thanks for your just continuing to give back, and what you're doing to help gun violence and reduce that, and using technology, and then building a team that's just grown phenomenally. I'm totally impressed. And it's been an honor to be on your podcast and to associate with a great person like you. So thank you.
Brooke, really appreciate it, and your service as well. 31 years. Awesome. Good luck. Really excited to see what you do with it.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. If you want to check out more from the podcast, head to zeroeyes.com/nobel, where you can see show notes, read more about our guests, and suggest guests or topics of your own. Until next time, stay in the fight. Don't ring the bell.